Welcome to today's webinar titled Conflict Resolution for Middle School. We are thrilled to have Tom Sherman with us today. Tom Sherman currently works with the Military OneSource program, where he has served as a clinical supervisor for 3.5 years. He has also worked with children and adults with mental health and substance use disorders. He also teaches master-level counseling courses in diversity, ethics, assessment, and internship. Without further delay, I will turn things over to Tom Sherman.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're calling in from. As Dan just shared, we're going to discuss conflict resolution for middle school age students today. Before we get started, I just want to read a quick disclaimer. The appearance of hyperlinks does not constitute endorsement by the Department of Defense of this website or the information, products, or services contained therein. For other than authorized activities such as military exchanges and morale, welfare, and recreation sites, the Department of Defense does not exercise any editorial control over the information you may find at these locations. Such links are provided consistent with the stated purpose of the Department of Defense sponsored webinar. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into what we're all here to discuss this morning. All right, our objectives of attending this webinar is to learn how to define what conflict is, learn about the different responses to conflict, learn about communication skills, and then learn ways to handle conflict. And flowing from the objectives is our agenda today. We'll discuss choices, steps for conflict resolution, communication skills, ground rules for handling conflict. We'll have time for discussion questions. So if anything comes up that you'd like to ask, we'll have time set aside for that at the end. And then a brief summary of what we discussed today. All right, so before we start talking about conflict, we have to define what conflict is. At the very basis, conflict is a disagreement between two or more people. Conflict is a normal part of life. Two people can't agree on everything all the time. And the important part we want to focus on, the reason we're discussing conflict management skills is conflict isn't always a negative. There can be positive results. How we get to those positive results depends on how we handle the conflict. So how do we approach the issue? How do we approach the person? How do we process the issue? And how do we arrive at a result? It's our reaction to conflict that can create problems. So we're going to discuss how to better approach conflict. And lastly, it's important to resolve conflict in a positive way. When we also talk about conflict, we want to think about the different types of conflict and how we approach it. Conflict can be aggressive through anger and verbal or physical aggression. It can involve emotional blackmail, which involves using words such as you always, you never, such as, you never take out the trash, you always yell at me when I do this. When we use those words, we automatically move the conflict into a more negative area where the person's ready to be defensive. It can be an appropriate use of power, especially when we're talking about dealing with adolescents. And it's basically using our authority as parents or teacher to say something like, while you're living in this house, you will. So it forces the person we're in conflict with to take a submissive role or to become more aggressive back towards us. And the last way is submissive type of conflicts where we try to give in or withdraw. We don't actually deal with the issue. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we discuss choices. So choices. Anytime we have a conflict with another person, we have a decision to make. How do we want to present ourselves? How do we want to address the conflict? And as we're just talking about, there's 3 different choices on how we can respond. We can be aggressive, which it would be trying to get the person to submit to get their needs met. And that can involve intentionally doing something to hurt another person, physically or emotionally, to make them do something they don't want to do. So in that type of choice, we're not really going in to have a conversation. We have an outcome in mind where we just want the person to comply. And in order to get them to comply, we're going to be heavy-handed. We can be submissive. So we may choose to start a conflict with someone, but not actually want to follow through to a conclusion. We give in to keep the peace. And we may end up going along with what someone else wants, even though that's not what we want. So we may begin a conflict saying, I have this specific need in mind. This is what I want to accomplish from doing that. But once the conflict begins, we back away to either calm down the other person, to not make waves. But what that leaves us with is we may not have our needs met. Conversely, if we approach someone aggressively to get our needs met, that other partner who we're having the conflict with may not get their needs met by withdrawing. And so it doesn't end up being a balanced conflict. At some point, one party's getting their needs met and the other party isn't, and living with the decision of not getting their needs met. And then we always have to ask, how will that come back up for us? And the last choice there is assertive. It's standing up for yourself while showing respect to the other person. Now, in some conflicts, it may not be possible for both parties to get their needs met. But by using some techniques we'll talk about later, we can make sure all parties feel heard and at least feel like they have a part in the decision-making process and feel more comfortable with the outcome, even if they don't get fully what they wanted, or if we don't get fully what we wanted. So steps for conflict resolution. In my experience, this first step, to stop and think, is usually where things come off the rails when people are going into conflict. If someone comes at us, we may feel the need to immediately respond to that conflict and address them because it's now been brought to us. Or we may be frustrated about something else and we decide this is a good time to air unattended grievances. So on the previous slide when we were talking about a withdrawing response, the next time someone comes to us, we may decide that's also a time to unload the last conflict that we withdrew from. So it's always important to stop and think. Even when someone comes to us with a issue that we need to address, it's fair to say, I need some time to think about this. Even if it's just 5 minutes to step away and think about it, to come back to it, it may give the person who's approaching the conflict time to calm down and also time to think about, how do I want this to proceed? So we get back to that choice piece. The stop and think lets us have time to make a choice. Stopping and thinking also allows us to stay calm. We can do our count to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, how do I want to address this? It allows me the initial passion of the conflict to cool off, especially if the person didn't respond how we expected them to. So even when we're initiating the conflict, we can say, you seem upset by this. I can feel myself being a little upset. Let's take a few minutes, and then we'll come back and discuss it. The third one may seem obvious, talking. But as we talked about on the other page, one response to conflict is withdrawing, not talking about it and just sitting with it and letting it dwell. We talk when we're ready, and we also want to set ground rules for the conflict. That's part of the talking of, we're ready to have this conflict. but here's what I think we should both adhere to before we have this conversation. And we'll talk about ground rules a little bit later in the presentation. Another critical component of conflict management is listening. With the assertiveness we talked about on the other side, like we said, both parties may not get their needs fully met, but what may help you get your needs met and the other party to not become aggressive withdrawal is making sure that they feel like they're heard. If the person feels like you're at least listening to them and that's setting up your response and where you're going, it helps with the staying calm and having a much more open dialogue. And on the next slide, we'll talk some more about how to facilitate listening and how to demonstrate that you're listening during conflict. If we have time to think ahead, or if we stop and think, we have time to think ahead. And when we're thinking ahead, we want to think about what our goal is. What do we hope is the ultimate outcome of this conversation? If we're the one who's preparing to begin a conflict, before we start, why am I doing this? What do I hope will change because of this conflict? Without a clear goal of what the resolution, the desired resolution is, that's when things can escalate. You may have the other person say, what do you want from me? And if you're not prepared to answer that, the person may stop hearing what your initial issue is. All I hear is you yelling at me. I don't know what you want from me. And two, if we plan ahead, we're less likely to get into knee-jerk reactions about what you want from someone. We're less inclined to say, I just want you to shut up and listen, which is in a very respectful tone and which is likely to either result in an aggressive response back to us or a withdrawing response. And we're thinking about the outcome and along with the next one coming up with a solution. We want to be concrete. We want to tell the other party what they can do to meet our needs. So we want to be specific. We want to be measurable. I want you to clean up your room. I want you to do it 2 times a week. And also when we're coming up with solutions, depending on the nature of the conflict, we want to have buy-in from the other party. This is sometimes difficult with children, but sometimes some reasonable negotiation is appropriate because the other party has needs too. So if you're able to meet my need, then perhaps I can also meet your need. If you clean up your room 2 times a week, then maybe we'll add $1 to your allowance, or we'll give you an allowance. Or the child may say, hey, if I clean up my room, can you take me to the park once a week? But at least having the other party be able to contribute to the solution from the conflict. Again, then they have some buy-in to what we're talking about, what we hope our ultimate resolution will be. And the last one is to ask for help. And this is internal and external to the conflict. So we're just talking about asking for internal help, discussing with the person you're in the conflict with, how can we both come to a resolution that we're both okay with. And sometimes external is good, of checking in. As a parent, I sometimes talk with other parents of, my kid's doing this and it's driving me nuts. How do you deal with this with your child? Have you had this experience? So looking outside of ourselves about how others in similar situations have resolved the issue. What's not on this slide, but is worth considering when we're talking about conflict resolution with, particularly with children, since that's kind of the focus of this, but it can relate to other types of conflicts, is we want to think about the power differential. As adults, we inherently have more power than the children, whether we're a teacher or a parent. And the child is acutely aware of this. They know that we are the authority figure. but that doesn't mean they're not going to test us. And sometimes that results in an aggressive response of, if you're pushing me, I'm going to push back and see where this relationship stands. Can I take the power by giving an aggressive response? Can I get the parent or teacher to withdraw, which changes the power dynamic in the relationship? Or if I don't feel like I can communicate with you as my parent or my teacher, I may withdraw. I hear what you're saying, and maybe I'll comply, but maybe I'll apply in a passive-aggressive way. I'll mow the lawn, but I'll cut zigzags into it. So this is why it's helpful to involve the child in the solution, so they recognize that we are recognizing the power differential, but also saying, I value you and your opinion. We want to avoid power struggles as parents and teachers, and think about, again, as we're negotiating this relationship between child and adult, which fights are worth having? Is eating all your vegetables rise to the same level of turning in your homework in your family? And this is something we have to decide on a one-to-one basis. But sometimes we have to let it go. We have to say, this is not the fight I'm going to have a back and forth with you. If we're not going to get into the power struggle, if we're not going to, go back and forth with the child, if you don't do this, and keep on escalating, we should have natural consequences. If you don't eat your vegetables, fine, we won't have dessert tonight. And that's into the argument. I'm not going to argue the merits of dessert with you. This is what you need to do. If you do this, then this is what you get. In stopping the conflict right there. If you don't mow the lawn, and do it well, then we're not going to go to the park later. Or, we're not going to get your allowance. But again, we're still talking in very clear parameters with, if you don't do this, then this is what the consequence is. Sometimes that ongoing conflict is useful, though, if we want to model for our child or the child conflict resolution skills. Let's talk this out. Let's have this negotiation. But negotiation is not always appropriate as an adult in an authority position. In the last one, for both ourselves and the child we're having the conflict with, what is the root of the issue? So going back to the vegetable example, am I really upset and having a conflict because you're not eating your vegetables? Or is it because, I had a hard day at work, I couldn't yell back at my boss, so now I'm yelling at my child because of that power differential, because I can yell at my child and get my frustration out of them. Going back to our stop and think, this is the time to stop and say, is this really the conflict I want to have? Do I want to have a conflict over green beans? It may be the child's being scurvy, that is the conflict you want to have, but otherwise, again, falling back on those natural consequences of, okay, don't eat your green beans, that's okay, no dessert. And then walking away from the argument, ending it there. Conversely, you may say, if you don't eat your green beans, no dessert. And you see the child escalate. And then we have to ask ourselves, is it really about the green beans, or did something happen with the child and that's the reason they're reacting the way they are? And again, this is why we don't want to get that power struggle of over the green beans, as the green beans may not be the source of the conflict. And so using the communication skills we'll discuss on the next slide, it may help illuminate what's that underlying issue about how the child's feeling, how we're feeling. And either help resolve the conflict or maybe move our open communication within the family or the school to a more useful direction. So communication skills during conflict resolution. Reflective listening. This is to get towards empathy. It's to let the other person we're in a conflict know that we've heard them. Again, we don't have to agree, we don't have to comply, but we want to at least let them know that we've heard what they said. What I'm hearing you say is you don't think it's fair that you have to mow the lawn. So it serves a twofold purpose. One, it serves to let them know we've heard them. And then second, if that's not correct, if that's not what they're saying, it gives the other party the chance to correct it. What I'm saying is, it's not that it's not fair that I have to mow the lawn, but it's not fair that I have to mow the lawn and my brother doesn't ever have to do it. We don't have to take turns. So now we're getting that, okay, there's another piece of this conflict that we would have been blind to had we not done this reflective listening piece. And it's good to also throw in feeling words sometimes to see how the person's feeling. What I'm hearing you say is that you're angry because of this, or you're sad because I did this. And it helps the child get in touch with their feelings. It helps them kind of slow down and think about, is that how I'm feeling? Is that what I'm doing? Because when we're talking about steps for conflict resolution, we're thinking about us talking with the child. The child may not have the same maturity or available resources that we have. So the reflective listening too gives them time to stop and think and kind of calm down. If we immediately go into it with an accusation, they're not going to think how they're responding. They're immediately going to go defensive and push back on that and challenge us on it without even thinking about what do they really want, what is their need in having this conflict. We want to use I statements, which keeps us away from blaming. Because the blaming is part of the power differential. If I, as a parent or teacher, say, you do this and it disrupts the whole family, I, as the authority figure, am accusing and scapegoating the child, which isn't conducive to good communication. And two, it helps the child recognize you demonstrating your maturity and taking some ownership in the conflict. So this may be further along in the conflict. When you yell at me, I feel hurt because I don't feel like you're hearing what I'm trying to tell you. Or when you don't mow the lawn, I feel like you're not contributing to this family because you're not doing your chores. And you may give examples of, I do the dishes, I do this. But you also want to be careful to not get into well, I do all this and I want you to do this little piece. Because again, then it goes into an escalation war of, well, I do this, this, and this. I have to go to school, I have to go to sports practice, I have all these things I have to attend to too. And just like the reflective listening, throwing a feeling in the I statement helps the child get some empathy towards you. They understand how you're feeling and that their actions are directly impacting you. They're not occurring in a vacuum. We also want to be aware of our nonverbal skills when we're communicating. Am I frowning at the child? Am I crossing my arms? Rolling my eyes? If you demonstrate disrespect towards the child's going to demonstrate disrespect back to you. Children are sponges. What we're modeling towards them is what they're going to show back to us. Tone is important. It's not included on the nonverbal, but the tone of our voice is part of that. If I'm yelling at the child, they're likely to yell back if I'm displaying that anger verbally. And sometimes we do it. Sometimes, children push our buttons to the point that it's very hard to contain our tone. but taking the breath, reorient it. And again, I'm yelling because I'm angry. So let me take a step back and let's try this again. And I'm saying that as a modeling of a conversation we can have with a middle school student. Because at this age, children are becoming aware of others and how their response is affected. And we should be modeling open communication and explaining, I am getting angry because you refuse to do your chores. So I'm going to try not to yell, and I'm going to ask you to do the same, and let's go from there. So going from there, ground rules for handling conflict. This is a good baseline. If I'm working with a family or couple, I sometimes like to see from them, what do you think is a good ground rule? Again, it's modeling that you are valuing their contribution to the conflict you're having. What's a good rule for our family when we are having a conflict? It's interesting to see, too, what children come up with, what they think is a useful ground rule, because it can sometimes serve as a mirror to ourselves about things that we didn't aware we were doing, weren't aware we were doing. But also, it may help with the child saying, this is how I receive messages best. And that way we can tailor our messages based on how the child receives them. So the first rule is pretty straightforward. One person talks at a time. We don't want to talk over each other, because when we talk over each other, our voices go up and up and up until we are yelling. And when we're yelling, that raises our heart rate. And so even if we're just trying to communicate by talking louder, the physiological changes of yelling is going to change the way we're viewing conflict. Because as our body, our heart rate speeds up, our pulse gets up, we're going to feel more aggressive. It's going to start tapping into that fight or flight response that occurs naturally. This one should be pretty obvious, no physical fighting. And it goes both directions. You want the child to know that it's not acceptable to lay hands on you, but part of doing that is also showing the child that it's not acceptable to lay hands on another person during a conflict. No emotional or verbal abuse. We don't want to name call. We don't want to do hurtful personal attacks. And we don't want to swear, because it can make us seem immature. And two, again, it's devaluing the person we're in the conflict with. You're not doing your homework because you're stupid. You're essentializing the child by saying that. So instead of saying, I want you to do your homework because it's important to us you do well. And then you can expand on whatever the reason doing well is important in your family or in the school. But as soon as you call someone stupid, well, the child's like, well, that's why I'm not doing my homework, because I'm stupid, and you have just confirmed everything I thought about myself. We want to be careful about picking apart pieces of the child. That's where the no personal attacks come from. Dealing with middle schoolers, there's some body changes and hygiene issues going on. The reason that your friends want to talk to you is because you stink, and you should probably brush your teeth more often. That's not going to be well received, as opposed to aligning with the child of, here's some deodorant, let's brush our teeth together maybe. I think by doing some of these things, your friends might want to talk to you some more, or at least it improves your approach to others if you're trying to make new friends. So sometimes attacking is the easiest way to get at the issue, but it's not the easiest way to get the other party to receive the message you're sending to them. Discuss only one issue at a time. This is a very important one. A lot of times when we get into conflicts, especially if we tend to withdraw and make the peace, when we get ramped up, we want to air all our dirty laundry. Yeah, now we're talking about you not doing the laundry or mowing the lawn, but you also don't do the laundry, you're failing at school. I'm just tired of all of your bad behaviors. When we put multiple conflicts into a single conflict, it puts the other person on the defensive, and nothing gets resolved because the person can't pick one of them to respond to. You can't pick one to respond to. And so the conflict escalates because there's not a clear outcome. So it goes back to, what's the goal of having this conflict? Because that's the immediate need you identified needed to be addressed. Mowing the lawn is what we want to address right now. Let's get that done. Once that conflict's been resolved, then maybe we can come back to the laundry issue. We can come back to the homework issue. But if we're just berating a person for all the things they do wrong at one conflict, again, we corner them into either withdrawing, so not talking with us and just kind of nodding, and not agreeing to a solution. Okay. But then once the conflict's done, the child doesn't do the laundry, they still don't mow the lawn, they're still not doing their homework. Or they become aggressive back. And again, we end up not having a solution. We escalate into personal attacks. It may with both parties storming away because there's no resolution. So when we have a conflict, not time to bring up the past. Choose which issue this conflict is going to be about. Don't blame others. Again, we want the child to know what we expect of them without blaming them. It makes me happy when you mow the lawn. And I find it challenging when you don't, because I have to come home after work and then I have to go do it. Or we have to have this conflict and neither of us leave it feeling well about it. So we want to own the conflict. We want to say what we want the resolution to be without blaming the child for any of their failures. If you weren't so lazy, if you weren't so stupid. So it's good to model, like I said, joint ownership of conflicts. We both have things. I understand you don't want to mow the lawn because you want to go play with your friends. And once you mow the lawn, you can do that. So how can we both get our needs met? Use good eye contact. That both lets you monitor, is the person seeing and receiving my message, but also shows respect when the child communicates back to you. Back with the nonverbals. We're not rolling our eyes. We're looking at them, maybe giving some other nonverbal encouragers like nodding our head to show that we're listening and we're hearing what they're saying. Again, take a time out if needed. If you feel yourself getting escalated or seeing the child get escalated, if the conflict isn't of critical import, say let's take 5 minutes. You go take your breath, I'll go take my breath, and we'll come back and we'll talk again. It may be send the child away with. Think about how we can resolve this. So put the onus on the child to kind of start thinking about solutions. And the last one there is be tolerant of the other person's ideas and opinions. Everyone's point of view is important. We don't want to disempower the child. We don't want them to feel like they don't matter, especially as we move into adolescence and the later teenage years. We want them to see that we value them and want them to feel like they can communicate with us. Because if we don't model good communication during these middle school years, when they're getting into more intense relationships, when they're getting challenged with alcohol and drugs, when they're getting challenged with other bad behaviors for peers, we want them to feel like they can talk to us, as opposed to isolating or solely going to peers. So don't undervalue the importance of making the child feel like we value them and value their opinion. We want to hear them out. Again, even if we don't agree and even if we're going to get our needs met, we want them to feel like they're part of the process. All right, some discussion questions just to think about. And think about us as adults, how we respond to conflict, because, again, what we model, what we do in our day-to-day is what our children are watching, what they're going to model back to us. When someone says something hurtful or insensitive to you, what's a good way to confront them without starting a fight? I always like to point to the workplace, but I know not everyone has the best boss. So thinking about how do you deal with conflict in the workplace without escalating, because open conflict in the workplace usually isn't well received. So how do we get our needs met in the workplace without starting a fight, or with our partner, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend? How do we have those arguments with other adults without getting escalated? Have you ever said something in the heat of an argument that you later regret it? What happened and how could you have handled it differently? Reflecting on our own conflict can give us insight in how to best approach our conflict with children. Most of us have a couple decades of experience under our belts of dealing with conflict. It's good to think about how we deal with it and how we resolve it, because we can also use that in storytelling with our kids. Because sometimes the conflict's not going to be between us and our child, but between our child and another child, and they may be coming to us about how to resolve conflict. So sharing, hey, this happened to me once, and here's how I dealt with it, can be a good story to have on hand and help send your child away with. The next one, have you ever gotten into a heated conflict because you were really upset about something else? We talked about this with the green bean. Thinking about what state you're in before you begin a conflict is important. Because sometimes we go looking for fights. I'm angry and I just need something to do with this anger. And it can be the smallest, silliest thing, but because I'm already heated and angry about something else, it becomes a much bigger conflict. You left that sock out of the laundry basket. Why are you so lazy? Why don't you ever carry your weight around here? Issue's probably not about the sock. It's probably about either built up frustration because we are withdrawing from previous conflicts, or something else in our life that we're just already heated and ready to go. And the last one, what are the benefits of resolving conflicts in a peaceful and positive way? For me personally, is what we were just talking about on the previous slide of keeping that open communication. If I deal with the conflict well, the child is likely, one, to deal with conflict with me better in the future. They're likely to model that conflict with others. And they're likely to bring issues that they're having back to me instead of holding on to them or having them manifest in some other way. And the better we deal with conflict, when we think about good conflict resolution, we think about dealing with things as they come up. It keeps a more balanced classroom, household. We're dealing with issues that come up. People in that household or classroom aren't holding on to things. They're not resenting you. They're not building up. They're not keeping tally of the wrongs against them. We deal with the conflict, we move on. Deal with the conflict, move on. But we keep moving. And together. You don't have someone who, I dealt with the conflict, I as a parent or teacher got what I needed. I'm moving on, but the child is still back here. The child hasn't moved on from that conflict. And I never know which future conflict it's going to blow up and show up in. In the conflict that it blows up and shows up in may be the really important conflict that I want the child to hear and that I want us to come to a good resolution on. But they can't because we haven't dealt with previous conflict in a positive and peaceful manner. All right, brief summary about what we talked about today. Pay attention to your feelings. Stop and think about, are you feeling angry? What space are you in before you begin that conflict? And we're not always going to go into a conflict calm. But we need to check ourselves and think about, am I saying this because I'm angry? Or am I saying this because it's part of the conflict and part of what we need to resolve? Usually a check and balance of that is, if it's going to be hurtful, if it's going to be blaming, if it's going to be name-calling, that's coming from me being angry. Versus maybe my tone is up, maybe my voice is a little tighter. I'm angry, but I'm still keeping to the point, I'm still following those ground rules we discussed. Remain calm as best as we're able. And again, if you feel like you can't remain calm, that may be the time to call a timeout. Because if the conflict is escalating and you're not calm, the likelihood of it coming back to a calm place is next to nil. So it's better to take the time out, regroup, and come back to it than to keep escalating, hoping that you will eventually overpower the person you're in a conflict with. To the same point, stay in control of your emotions and behaviors. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be frustrated. Pay attention to how it's affecting the conflict. Pay attention to the feelings the other person's expressing. Are they getting angry? Are they escalating? Is it time for you to step in as an adult and say, all right, let's slow down for a minute. Let's pump our brakes, calm down, reorient, and come back to it. Are they crying? We've talked a lot about aggressive responses, but maybe your aggressive response results in them becoming sad because they're feeling like they have to submit, they can't win, they're not being heard. So pay attention to their feelings and also reflect those feelings. I see you're crying. What's going on right now? What's happening for you? And when you ask those questions, make sure you listen to the other person. Are we arguing about the same thing? Is this conflict, are we coming at it looking at it the same way, or are there some other pieces is this just the tip of the iceberg for you? Are there other pieces to this conflict that I'm not aware of, that I won't be aware of unless I ask you? And then be tolerant of differences. Again, your needs and the child's needs may not always be met 100%, and that's okay. And it's also okay for the child to feel like they're not being treated fairly because they have a limited world response. They may feel like it's the most unfair thing in the world that they have to mow their lawn while their friend down the street's dad mows the lawn for them. I understand that works in their house, but this is how we do it in our house. So again, we're validating, we're indicating that we hear them, but the reality of the situation is, in our household, you mow the lawn because that's how you help her out here. But we don't want to go back into it and tell the child, you're wrong, I don't care what they do. It's okay that they're seeing other things and they're thinking other things. But we need to help them recognize our shared worldview as a family, as a classroom. All right. So that's the end of the slides for today's presentation. Are there any questions from the group?
Tom, we do have some questions that have come in. The first question reads, what can I do before a conflict begins in our family to minimize conflict?
Mm-hmm. So this goes back to the wanting to model open communication, of setting up good parameters for a family before the conflict begins. Spending time is helpful. Just spending time together. So we're not just connecting as a family when we're in conflict. I'm showing the child I enjoy being around them, I enjoy their presence. And in order to continue that harmony, we sometimes have to have a conflict. You modeling, sharing your feelings, and asking for help. Sometimes asking the child to help come up with a solution maybe for a lower tier conflict of, this is the problem the family's facing. These are the chores we have. How should we divvy them up? And of course, we want to stack the deck that we're okay with it, whatever the outcome is, but showing the child that we can have positive communication, positive conflicts, before those critical conflicts of where we need the child to do something. Be kind. It seems obvious, but we want to, again, show our child or show the child that we value them, that we're praising them when they do things well. Again, we don't want to just be critical, because if we're only critical, the child's eventually going to think that we don't value them, and they're going to stop valuing our opinion. And so I think those are the keys: spending quality time together, modeling good conflict resolution, modeling good communication before conflict arises, and demonstrating that you value the child outside of times of conflict, so that when it is a time of conflict, they value us in return.
Thank you. Next question reads, what about conflict that happens outside of the home, i.e. issues with peers at school?
So we talked a little bit about that, about how we model conflict. It may also be how the child takes and models the conflict in school. So, if we yell at the child, they're more likely to yell at their peer. If they yell at their peer, teachers, authority figures are more likely to pay attention to that conflict. And even if they're in the right, so in the example of bullying, if they're escalating and the teacher just happens to see them escalate, they're likely to get in trouble with the person. So we want to model good conflict in our home, but also talk about how to address conflicts with peers. The skills we talked about, they can model, but things about trusting adults. We want our children to feel safe around adults. We want to have them feel comfortable they can talk to us. We want them to feel safe they can talk to a teacher if something is happening at school, if they're being bullied. Talk about how to approach the other person. Can you confront them in a positive way? If it's something like gossiping, I heard you were talking about me. That does hurt my feelings. And sometimes, depending on the age of the child and the nature of the other child, that message may be received. If it's not received, talk to your child about what they value in other people. Is this the person you want to be your friend? Is this a conflict worth having? And then sometimes, teaching your child withdrawing is the appropriate response. If someone is mean, maybe you should remove yourself from that situation, because conflict in the school is not always going to be helpful, or conflict with other peers is not always going to be helpful. So just helping staff your child's toolbox of, one, here's what positive conflict looks like in our household. Two, here's some different situations where talking to the person may be helpful, withdrawing, finding new friends may be the most or the best action, or talking to a teacher may be the best action for you.
Thank you. Next question is, all conflicts aren't face-to-face, so in today's world, what about social media conflicts, online conflicts?
Mm-hmm. Part of that, it is a challenging world to navigate out there. As we're just talking about with the face-to-face conflict, sometimes unfriending that person, not exposing yourself to those negative messages. So the person's not your friend, not seeking out those responses. I'm not going to go on Twitter to see what this person said about me, because all it's going to do is upset me. Talking with friends about what they want to hear. So if a peer comes to them and says, hey, such and such said you have stinky feet. That's a terrible example, but letting their friend know, it doesn't matter to me what that person said, and I'd appreciate if you did share that with me. Let's focus on our relationship. So helping them kind of tune out those other messages and selectively attend to what they want to hear. And again, this goes back to valuing the child too, is we want to prop up their self-esteem as best as we can, because the stronger sense of self they have, and the more they think we value them, they value themselves, the better they are going to be to ignoring these messages that are out there in the world that we as adults don't have control over, they don't have control over, because they obviously can't control what other people are saying about them.
Okay, thanks. At this time, we don't have any other questions. So I would like to thank you, Tom Sherman, for sharing your valuable experience and expertise. I would also like to thank our attendees for participating in today's webinar. And attendees, if you find yourself having questions after the webinar is over, please email moswebinars@militaryonesource.com, and I'll get the questions over to our presenter, and we'll get an answer back to you as soon as we can. At this time, this concludes today's webinar on conflict resolution for middle school. I would like to thank you all for attending, and have a great day.